Same here, Steve. It's my pleasure to be with you, and I appreciate it.
All right, so let's start with this. There are 14 transfers that could play a role somewhere with West Virginia this year. What is it taking for Neil Brown to really remake this roster into one that he thinks can move the program forward?
Well, certainly a good question, and I think the answer to that is, as you know, Steve, this transfer portal world that we've been in here now for several years, I think schools have tried to figure it out. Do you go with accomplished players at a lower level and cross your fingers and hope that they can rise to this level and be productive, or do you go the other side of it, and do you go a Power 5 player, obviously, that's either played a lot or has started in the past, but sometimes not a starter, but a guy that may have been behind a really good player, and take your chances there. I think that Neil's done it a couple of different ways since he's been here, now leaning more toward, a little bit higher level of competition when he brings a guy in. I think a couple of those guys that he's brought in, for example, Devin Carter from North Carolina State, a wide receiver who will play on Saturday night. Another guy out of the Big Ten Conference, Beanie Bishop, was a backup cornerback from the University of Minnesota. I think probably like a salt reference, we're going to sprinkle those guys in like salt. I don't think they have to come in and play massive roles for this team to be successful, but I do think they are a needed piece to what this team could have this season.
Which then brings me to the next part. And I think I mentioned to you this when we talked this morning. It was in the context of an answer, and I said something about it looks to me like when I watch tape, the strength of the football team's your offensive line. It sounded like Neil echoed that today. What's your thought on that group up front, which is a veteran group?
It's a great question. So here's what happened, Steve. When Neil Brown took over, and this is his 5th season, the offensive line was absolutely deplete of what you need to play with at this level. There was one player on the entire roster that he inherited that was drafted into the NFL within that first 3 years that he was here, i.e. guys that he inherited. Mm-hmm. And that one player was the left tackle, Colton McKivitz, who's played several seasons now for the San Francisco 49ers. The point is, he started from scratch. So over the course of the previous 4 seasons, he put this line together. Coincidentally, and difficult to do, but 3 of those starters on the offensive line are from right here in West Virginia, and 2 and maybe all 3 of them are going to have a chance to play in the NFL. The left tackle is Wyatt Milam, the center is Zach Frazier, and one of the other tackles is Doug Nestor, and they all 3 have an opportunity. So now he went from 0 to going into Saturday's game. They've got a little over 130 career starts among that group. And it has become the strength of the team after really being the biggest weakness on the team.
Which then brings me to running back. There's 4 guys that can play there, but it looks like C.J. Donaldson is a guy that a lot of fans should take a look at. When you see number 4 out there, what do you see in him that allows him to be a really good back that fits with this offensive line?
What stands out is that he's unique for a back. He doesn't look like the running backs that we see on a regular basis, because a year ago when he came into this program, he was a tight end. And just on hey, let's give him a chance last summer's camp, let's give him a chance and see what he can do at running back. And everyone thought they had recruited a tight end, and instead they started him at the running back spot during preseason camp in August. We go and play at Pitt last year, and he explodes. And the only thing that stopped him during the course of the season was injury. He had a significant concussion against Texas. He then suffered a bad break against TCU late in the season. It required surgery, which has shelved him. He returns this Saturday. But he's a big guy, Steve, 240 pounds, which, as I said, we just don't see those guys. Right. But in addition to him, you've got another couple of guys that have played quality football, Justin Johnson and Jalen Anderson. Yep. Each of the 3 have all run for over 100 yards in a game in their careers. So I would say that, they've got depth, legitimate depth at that running back position.
And not only that, there's a youngster there, a freshman, and then, of course, a lot of people will be interested in the freshman Rodney Gallagher at wide receiver. Right. What's your thoughts on that, and also the Ray kid?
Yeah, so you're on it, buddy. So Those two players, Traylon Ray and Rodney Gallagher, and we'll do Rodney Gallagher first. Rodney Gallagher, great recruiting story in that at one time he was ranked the number one player in the nation as a basketball player, and played on LeBron James's son's team, and he was highly acclaimed, but stuck with football. And he's just from he's Uniontown, Pennsylvania, so just over the border from us here, and highly sought after. And so I think he has surprised WVU coaches because I think they thought all along he was going to be a really good player, but they didn't think he was going to be really good right off the bat because just physically, it takes time. But he's got that great twitch, and I think that's kind of what's going to separate him. And Neil said earlier today during his press conference that he definitely will see action on special teams, but he'll probably be in the mix as well, running routes as a slot receiver. The other one is Traylon Ray, and he looks the part, and he's got really nice size, and he's just one of those guys that during the course of preseason camp just continued to show himself in scrimmages and making plays, and you kind of start looking around and you go like, wait a second, who's that? That's the Ray kid. That's the Ray kid. And so he's making plays. Now, does that translate into Saturday night success or September success? I don't know. They're freshmen. It takes a little bit of an adjustment period. But sometime, whether it's this season or a year from now, those guys are going to become very impactful players.
West Virginia knows its starting quarterback. The team knows its starting quarterback. But they're not going to release who it is, which is the prerogative of Neil Brown. And they're not going to release a depth chart this week. And Penn State doesn't release one either. So, okay. But when you look at the two guys that are primarily there, starting with Garrett Green, what does each bring to the table that fans in Beaver Stadium should be looking at?
Probably the ability to make plays if the play isn't there, or to run plays specifically designed for the quarterback. What West Virginia has not had in a good while now has been a quarterback that can extend plays with their feet. And as you know, in this game today, you really need to. You have to be. And especially going back to our offensive line woes over the previous couple of seasons, man, was it badly needed. I think both Garrett Green and Nico Marchiol both have the ability to do that. Green perhaps more so. I think Nico can be he can be a competent guy that can run out of the pocket, extend a play, extend a drive, look downfield. But I think Garrett Green has big boy speed. He's one of those guys that has clocked in over, 20, 21 miles per hour on the GPS. So when he goes, he can go. That's probably the biggest change at quarterback, and that's the biggest thing that I think Mountaineer fans are interested in seeing is what does a Neil Brown offense look like with a quarterback that can make plays with his feet, because we just have not had that up until this point in the previous 4 seasons.
So what are you seeing from this group defensively? You mentioned Beanie Bishop from Minnesota, and he'd started out Western Kentucky, then he went to Minnesota, so Penn State's seen him before. Cobb from Buffalo has been brought in as well. They have Marcus Floyd. What do you see in that defense that makes West Virginia better, especially in a conference like the Big 12 where offense, for the most part, is dominated, at least until the last couple of years ago, defenses in the Big 12 have been a lot better?
So, 2 parts to your answer.
Yeah.
I think that just from a talent perspective, the coaches feel that the level of talent has improved from where it was a year ago. And I think the second part of it is, Steve, we just had a really difficult time last season, and I think it was paralysis by analysis, that these guys just weren't properly getting in pre-snap alignment, and as a result, you had yourself some significant issues. They have strived in this offseason to do several different things, but one of the biggest objectives starting back in the spring was, simplify it down so that we're playing football and rather not thinking about playing football. So that was object number 1, was to pre-snap alignment, be where you're supposed to be, and let guys just not overthink it. I think the second part of it is, and we'll see how this test goes on Saturday, but the second part of it is, just the overall ability to be extremely physical and to successfully tackle. Now, we've known each other for a ton of years, more than we want to admit, right? And so through the years, right, West Virginia's defense, while not always being the most talented on the field, after it was over, people knew that they played West Virginia, right? It was that blue collar, just hammer people, lunch pail, Don Nehlen mentality. We're going to be physical. Well, as you know, the game has changed significantly. You can't even hit like you used to be able to hit, and that's probably a good thing for the overall health of the game of football going forward. But we collectively, West Virginia, I don't play, but the West Virginia collectively, we need to get back that physicality, which I think has really lacked, especially last season. If it's anything, we've got to be just hard-nosed and tough. Now, with your two dudes running that football, it's going to be the ultimate challenge. I started thinking about this earlier today, actually, after we talked this morning, and that was the fact that this is kind of like, for West Virginia schedule-wise, this is a NASCAR season. Like, we're starting with the Daytona 500 in the sense that this is probably the single most talented team that we'll see for the course of the year. You never know how things are going to shake out, but at least on paper, it's not even close.
Sure.
And so, to me, you're gonna have to bring it full throttle from the first game. And so that's what they focused on. They focused on, making tackles. Your guys are unbelievable in yards after contact, especially with the running backs. And so that, to me, is going to be the biggest thing. Are you pre-snap aligned? When you have the opportunity to make an open field tackle, are you securing and bringing that ball carrier down? Those are the biggest things for me.
There'll be two former Penn State players on the West Virginia side. That would be Fatorba Molba at defensive tackle, and it's Spear, which is a combination outside linebacker, safety, and Lance Dixon. How have each progressed in your mind?
I think in the case of Dixon, and you probably know this, right, a guy that has all of the credentials and has been highly touted. At times, he has stood out. At other times, he just kind of been there, to be quite honest with you. They are hoping that he finally gets to that point where he's just a consistent guy every single Saturday, that he's out there and he's making plays, but has ability, and just fingers are crossed that it is a consistent display. They really need him to play extremely well.
What does it mean to the fans in the state of West Virginia that they have both Pitt and Penn State on the schedule this year, regardless of result? I mean, we'll see how it plays out, but they have them both back.
I think as you know, the regionality of college sports is really the essence of college sports. It's why we love college sports, through the years, geographically being close to one another to play in these games, because invariably, right, we've got Penn State alums that live in West Virginia and vice versa, and, that's what makes college sports. And it obviously has just become diluted. And so, to answer your point, yeah, they love it. They absolutely love playing these schools. However, here comes the big however. Our schedule has not been well thought out. And I said this a decade ago when they started adding these games to the non-conference schedule. Here's the reality of it. You get 3 non-conference games as a member of the Big 12 Conference.
Right.
And West Virginia now has been playing 2 Power 5 teams among those 3 non-conference games. That's absolutely ludicrous. We were one of 2 schools in the country last year that played 11 Power 5 schools. That's one thing. And now for the 3rd consecutive year, we're opening on the road at a Power 5. We've got Maryland, Pitt, and now Penn State. That's just silly. That's nonsense. Right. I'm all for playing traditional rivals. I say we play one a year, whoever it is, if it's Pitt, Penn State, Virginia Tech, Maryland, whoever it is, play one of them. The other 2, you schedule accordingly, teams that, you probably have a really good chance to win, and you take your shot, and you come out of your non-conference 2-1 or 3-0, and then you go swing it in the league and see what you do. But right now, we've been overscheduled, and it's not been wise.
Yeah, and you have to be smart about how you go about it. You have to realize the pathway in front of you. And from a college football playoff point of view, when Washington made it in 2016, and their non-conference was Portland State, Idaho, and Rutgers, that was the indication to everybody that, hey, just go out and win your conference games.
Exactly.
Okay. obviously the Big 12 has been ultra aggressive in expansion. They were able to stay relevant and alive after Texas and Oklahoma announced they were leaving by getting Houston, Cincinnati, UCF, and BYU. Now in the latest round, the return of Colorado to go with Utah, Arizona, Arizona State. Your thoughts on, and you and I, this is something he and I already have talked about this today, but Tony's gearing up for that short jaunt over to Tucson.
Yeah, so you're asking me what I think of it?
Yep.
So I think I gave you half the answer already. Yeah. As a traditionalist, it bums me out that you're not playing these regional rival games, that's why people get excited. Okay, that's fine. The other part of it is that this is morphed from college athletics, and this is professional sports right now, both on the basketball side and on the football side. And so in order to be in the game, in order to have the proverbial seat at the table, you had to play along with this, or otherwise you would have gotten left out. Right. When West Virginia made the move to the Big 12 Conference, and this will be our 12th season in the Big 12, it was a result of both Syracuse and Pitt departing from the Big East to go to the ACC. Big East became vulnerable, and we needed a safety net. Had we not reached the safety net of the Big 12, invariably we could have been left out, and you could have become what Connecticut is suffering through right now. And you saw the absolute demise of their football program after they played, in a Fiesta Bowl. Yep. So it worked. You have to play the game. And I'll say this about the Big 12 Conference. Other than the geography, other than being up until this point, the closest rival, so to speak, was Iowa State, which is 800 miles away from Morgantown. Other than that, it's a wonderful fit. And by that I mean the conference is made up primarily of land-grant institutions. Right. And so Kansas State fans and Oklahoma State fans and Oklahoma fans and Texas Tech fans and, Iowa State fans, they're West Virginia fans. I mean, that's their thing. Very similar from a mission standpoint of the universities. Right. Geography, no. Level of competition, it's been wonderful. The round robin up until this most recent expansion of bringing in the other four schools, you play everyone in your conference twice, home and away, in on-campus gyms. It was fantastic. Geography, yeah, but again, it's the price to pay if you want to be in this business, and this is where we are right now.
Yep, it certainly is. Tony, appreciate it. Look forward to talking to you tonight as well on your show, and that'll be a lot of fun. He and I go back 39 years, is that right?
Yeah, this is my 40th season covering WVU. Yeah. Yep. Amazing.
Remember that comment he made about we've known each other longer than we care to admit? That could be it. My friend, thanks so much. All the accolades you've received, you've earned. So we congratulate you on that because you've earned them.
Thanks so much, Steve. My pleasure. It's great to be with you, and we'll chat with you this evening.
Yeah, that's a story for another time. It was it's way too close, and it is far, far worse than what's being covered right now. I talked to the sheriff on the way out, and he was saying the death toll is going to get around 1,000 people. It's just pray for those people. Buddy, it happened so fast. There was no warning. There was no way to get a warning out. It was 30 feet a second, and we just watched it. It was crazy.
Yeah. Well, thank goodness you're out of there and back home safe and sound. So.
No, I appreciate it. And I appreciate you guys.
Oh, no. I was thinking about you the whole time. I kept thinking the whole time, like, Tony, because I'm watching this. It becomes exponentially more personal when you've got a good friend there. So, okay.
The videos are detailed, but the thing that was the craziest was the exploding cars, boats, and then the two gas stations blew up. So when we got evacuated and we're driving out of there, racing away from the fire, it sounds like a war zone. It's just there's stuff blowing up everywhere. And buddy, the thing that was the weirdest is that I'm an athlete. I'm used to high pressure situations. I couldn't feel my hands. My hands got cold. It was the weirdest thing. So I digress. That's another conversation. I know. Appreciate you guys.
That'll be a private conversation you and I have. How about that?
Yeah, exactly.
The Pac-4. Okay.
We called it. We said this. You've got to have a clip somewhere where we said USC is going to leave the Pac-12 and it's going to fall apart. We've been saying this for years, you and I.
Yes, I know. But again, you and I are told we have no contacts. All right, so okay. That's a different topic for a different day, because we're not going to sit there and list all the people we know. But this happens, and USC and it's not Colorado. USC is the Pied Piper that makes all this happen. But what made the Pac-12 presidents, and again, let's go back to September last year, you and I talked about the $50 million per school that George demanded, George Kliavkoff. But it comes from the presidents, and you and I knew that 30 was on the table for ESPN. What made them think that they could get that much more?
So, it's a long answer. What happened with the Pac-12 started in 2011. And if you look back through the entire time frame,
is this when Bill Moose said everybody needs to have an equal share?
It was Bill Moose and Larry Scott.
Yep.
When they signed the $3 billion deal, and it was the biggest deal going at the time, and they were going to roll out the Pac-12 networks. And if you look at that, and we can get into that in detail, in summary, and then we can go into detail of how this fell apart and why they thought they could get $50 million. The person who comes across actually as kind of the worst bad guy at the end of the process is USC. It's Carol Folt. Because they believed at the time, when they had Texas Tech, and they had 4 schools looking to join. And Carol Folt blocked it. The same university that then left 18 months later blocked 4 new schools coming in. And when the 4 new schools were coming in, those were the numbers that were being put in front of them, were $45 to $60 million. Right? And the argument was made that we don't need them. We can still drive that kind of dollar amount, especially if we can get our major national brands back to prominence. And that's USC, UCLA, Washington, kind of Oregon. I know Oregon likes to think that they're nationally prominent, but you're not meeting anybody in New York who's watching the Oregon game. And so that's where the number came from. And so it's just like anything else. To try to put it in a layman's terms as much as possible, and how it's been explained to me a lot by people who are in the room, right? And Mike Bohn's a friend. He thank goodness for him. I'm not standing up for anything that he is accused of doing. I don't know what that is, but he was part of the reason that USC got out of this. When people, when their house depreciates in value or something happens, they just have a hard time understanding or appreciating that that's what it is now, right? There's an old saying that the market is the market. It's much like how we're looking at, Penn State grad Saquon Barkley saying, I should be getting historical running back numbers, and the market's coming back and saying, that's not the market anymore. And so he's holding out. That's what happened with the Pac-12 presidents. They just have this psychological disposition that, well, no, that can't be real, that we can't get $50 million and $30 million, which is the number. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, you know it better than I do. I think the Big 12, when USC was going to poach the 4 teams after Oklahoma and Texas left, was around $30 million, right?
Yes.
It was like 27 to 31 million?
Yes.
Yeah. So they were, you have a group of very powerful people who nobody says no to them, sitting in a room saying, wait a minute, we could have just bought those 4 houses for $30 million, and we thought that was nowhere close to enough money, and now you're telling us that's all we can get? No.
Right.
We need 50. And going back to what you said about Bill Moose, so I'm going to bore the listeners for a second unless they care about this, but in 2011, Larry Scott signs this deal with the $3.5 billion deal, biggest deal in sports. He's going to roll out the Pac-12 networks even though he has no carriage rights. He completely blunders that. Larry Scott makes $50 million to essentially create a 100-year-old conference. Mm-hmm. But Bill Moose sits down at the table with Larry Scott and the rest of the and UCLA and USC come, and they do what everybody has done with every league that's formed in the past. And they said, look, we are the stalking horses here. We are the biggest brands. We need a bigger share. And anybody can sit there and say that doesn't seem fair, but it is fair. It's not any different than in the Big Ten, right? Rutgers shouldn't get the same share as Penn State. We just know it, and people know it. The English Premier League was built that way, around the top 5 teams getting more money. And the NFL, thank goodness for the Maras and the Rooney's and the original owners, because they were the same way. New York and Green Bay were driving all of the money, and they were taking more, but they were making sure everything was taken care of. So Bill Moose, who for your listeners, will recognize him from hiring Scott Frost in Nebraska. He was the guy at Oregon that kind of helped them come to prominence under Phil Knight's time. He hired Mike Bellotti, and they got a little more prominent. He is the AD at Washington State at the time, and he comes back and says, no, everybody should get an equal share, and we want to build our sub-brands into national powerhouses. We think Washington State should be a national name. He honestly believed this. And so he demanded and got the teams to vote and the presidents to vote to get the same amount of money for Washington State that goes to USC for football. And he takes the money and he spends $8 million on Mike Leach every year, and he builds a ridiculous stadium that nobody goes to in Pullman. We talked about this. I believe that was the day that USC was gone. Right? Because at the time, USC is under restriction from the NCAA.
Yep.
They've got the sanctions on them. The team sucks. Lane Kiffin had been fired a year prior. They're down, and now they're getting kicked while they're down. It was a matter of time before we got to this point where USC said, okay, this isn't going to work anymore. This isn't the SEC. This isn't the Big Ten. I mean, the Big Ten has how many nationally prominent brands? You know, Penn State, Ohio State, Michigan. You have a lot of nationally prominent brands.
Yep.
The Pac-12, people on the West Coast may not believe this, but I'm sure your listeners would agree. You really don't have much. Arizona basketball, UCLA basketball, USC football, used to be UCLA football, Washington from time to time, you know, Oregon from time to time. Nobody cares about the rest. Nobody's staying up late to watch Stanford play, you know, Arizona State.
No.
And that's what happens. And so you have these chancellors and these presidents saying, hold on a second. 3 years ago, you were telling us $30 million is nowhere near enough. It's going to evaporate the Big 12. And we're going to go take 4 of their teams, and now you're telling me I have to accept $30 million? No.
Right. Exactly. I mean, and that's exactly right. And that's what it comes down to. Now, and I'd like to point, to my knowledge, I've never met Carol Foltz. I do know what her reputation is, though, and she is, quote, not a shrinking violet. In other words, she has a backbone to her, and she has opinions.
She does. And she's done a great job for USC. That's the important statement here. In the end, everybody goes back down to the money. And that's what happened here. You have, I mean, if you think about how ludicrous the timeline of this and how this happened is, it is a case study in selfish idiocy. You had these 10-member schools. This is back before Colorado, Utah joined. So these 10-member schools who spend decades demanding an equal share with the national brands, demanding that Oregon State basketball should get the same revenue share as Arizona basketball, demanding that USC football needs to share their money with Cal, who has some of the worst football facilities in the country. They're not even spending it. And you spend decades saying this. You crater your own conference, fighting for this. And then the minute the conference looks like it's on shaky ground, Oregon and Washington, the 2 schools who believed they were closest to USC and UCLA, take a cut rate share to join the Big Ten. Mm-hmm. So you literally spent decades saying, I am worth exactly as much as these 2 schools, until Kevin Warren and Carol Fulton and everybody, the big kids, get involved, and they say you're not. And you can either take what you're worth because the market is the market, or you can go play in the Mountain West.
And they took
it's amazing.
And they took the long-term play with the next contract where they're going to get an equal share down the road. That's what they're counting on. Apple offered $23 million, then kicked it up to $25 million. I don't think people realize, Tony, how tough a negotiator Apple is. And they are, again, let's go back to the term shrinking violet. That's not Apple.
No. So what's fascinating about Apple and all of this, and what's fascinating, I mean, and to get back to the share piece for the listeners, Stanford and Cal said they'd take nothing in their first year in the ACC.
That's right.
So you went from cratering your 100-year-old conference because you demanded every single penny that UCLA and USC got, to I'll take nothing, I just want to be on the team. Yeah. That is shockingly idiotic from 2 supposedly prominent universities. aren't you think tanks? This is you guys have a graduate school of business at Stanford that's internationally prominent. Couldn't brought somebody in to help you out with this one? You ended up with nothing. I mean, talk about buffoonery. And then you went and publicly picked yourself out to the ACC who said no.
Yep.
I mean, you're supposed to be the Directors' Cup champion, right? So Stanford has won 26 of the last 29 Directors' Cup. This is the who wins the most national championships across all sports. Because Stanford dominates in the Olympic sports, and they always have. Two, you're going to play in the Mountain West?
Yeah.
I mean, how does that look for recruits? You know how we were going to USC and UCLA and Arizona? We're going to Boise State now.
Yeah. Let's go to Fort Collins. Have a good time.
Enjoy it.
Yeah.
So the crazy thing about the Apple point, so to your point with Apple is, one thing that's getting lost in all this is Apple doesn't just make up dollars. If they didn't get this deal, they're not done.
Mm-hmm.
They're not done. They have budgets set aside, and they have identified this as a way that they want to continue to build in their live events portfolio. So you better believe that the Big Ten's talking to them. You better believe that the SEC is talking to them about streaming rights, about how do we work around contracts so we don't end up in a position like the ACC is. Which, by the way, we've been talking forever about that grant of rights. How excited is the ACC about that grant of rights right now? Because without it, Florida State is long gone, and Clemson's following them.
Well, I've said this, two parts to the grant of rights. Number one, if it was so easy to break, why are Texas and Oklahoma paying $50 million each between grant of rights and exit fee to get out of the last year of the deal? And number two, Florida State's been grumbling about this for 18 months. If you can't find it in 18 months, the key sentence that can get you out of it, it's not there.
You're not out. It's not there. And 2036, that's 13 more years, my friend.
Yep.
You've got a long way to go, Florida State. A long way to go.
And the numbers are stark. It's a $120 million exit fee, and the total media rights over 13 years involving Florida State is $500 million on the grant of rights. They would have to negotiate an incredible sweetheart deal. You're talking $500 million when it's all said and done to get to 2036, because every Florida State home game, if they just break it and go, would all revert to the ACC.
Yep, every single one. And so you know that Apple, who knows people that we don't know, is involved in every one of these talks.
Yep.
Every one of them. So what the Big 12 did that was so smart is they went and hired the mega players. They went and hired William Morris. For the listeners who don't know who William Morris is, William Morris Endeavor, William Morris bought Endeavor. Endeavor was Ari Emanuel's firm. The listeners who watched Entourage will know who Ari Gold is. It's that firm.
Yes.
Right? They called in the hitters. Brett Yarmark showed up and said, I'm not going to goof around with this. I'm going to pay the people who can get meetings I can't get, and we are going to turn this into a power conference. And he did a great job of selling to the universities what that share was going to be, and now he's sitting great. He got Colorado back. I mean, look, Deion's only going to be there for 2 or 3 years.
Sure.
But it's a good win to get Colorado back. They were originally a Big 8 member. And you get Arizona basketball, which really helps with Texas leaving. It plugs in that rival that Kansas needs on the basketball side.
Yep.
But you and I both know this is all about football.
It's all
no, basketball doesn't even come up in the conversation on this.
Well, what's interesting, and your mark has nothing to do with what I'm about to say, but if you notice, where is the grant of rights filed for the Big 12 where you get that kind of corporate relief that you need? The grant of rights for the Big 12 is filed in Delaware, which is, okay, a lot of people don't realize that. That's where it's filed. It's in Delaware. Okay, so now
in Delaware, which is where my business is incorporated.
Yes,
for the same reason.
That's exactly why I brought it up, because I knew that. And there are reasons why you do that, right? There are reasons why a business does that and incorporates in Delaware. So
it's corporate protection. It's very difficult for the states to get involved because what gets lost in a lot of this work, the one thing that shocked me, where I was a little bit wrong, I'm wrong a lot, so I'm not defending myself, but remember we talked about this, we said the biggest problem Oregon and Washington are going to have it's going to be Oregon State. Because Oregon and Oregon State are tied at the hip, just like Washington State are. It's been pretty well known that Washington State wants to move to the MWC. right? They're more local to it. Idaho's right there. It just makes more sense for them. But Oregon State didn't. Oregon State is a powerhouse in baseball.
Yep.
They don't want to move to the Mountain West.
Nope.
And now what? Somehow Oregon got away from them. Somehow the legislature allowed Oregon to separate from Oregon State. I'm not that surprised with Cal and UCLA, just because Cal has shown that they don't care about football. Right? They've made it pretty clear that football is just not going to be an investment for them. And for the listeners who don't know, Stanford Stadium used to fit 90,000 people. It fits 35,000 now.
Yeah.
I mean, they just blatantly came out and said, we're going to cut the attendance in half. People aren't coming.
Right. Well, in fact, that's where, when it was 90,000 seats, they hosted the Super Bowl. They hosted Super Bowl 19.
Right.
All right. So
49ers.
Yep, 49ers beat Dan Marino's Super Bowl appearance. They beat the Dolphins. So what now?
Right, Roger Craig.
Right. Who should be in the Hall of Fame, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
So what now for Oregon State, Washington State, Stanford, Cal? I know Rick Neuheisel, who's very passionate about the Pac-10, 12, 8, whatever, because he grew up in it. He's coached in it at two different places, so it means a lot to him. Is there any way in a package, in a merger, they can survive and at least keep the Pac whatever name?
Yes, but here's the problem. The chip that the Pac has is that they are still considered a Power 5 conference.
Right.
And there's still a negotiation going around about automatic bids in Power 5 conferences. And there's the Rose Bowl. The thing that gets lost a lot here is the Rose Bowl. The reason this all happened is because this was really the last year the Rose Bowl had the ability to say, I want it to be, Big Ten, Pac-10, right? That part of the contract expired after this last game. And now it's going to make it easier. The Rose Bowl is basically saying, look, we're part of the CFP now. That tradition is not going to be a part of what we're doing anymore.
Right.
So, the problem is, we talk about this a lot. We talk about major markets, but then we talk about the actual traction that people have in a major market. And so the schools that are thrown around pretty regularly are kind of like the mid-major that want to be bigger, the Fresno States, the San Diego State. I mean, I would challenge anybody in Pennsylvania to even point to me on a map where Fresno is. Right? I mean, we know where it is out here. I used to drive through there. But Fresno, they use a lot of loose numbers to say, well, the entire valley is technically Fresno, therefore we have, 600,000, viewer homes signed up as opposed to 200,000, but it's not. I mean, it's a really wide base that they're trying to get to. Boise State, schools that you would know if you're watching late night games, but they're just not nationally prominent. So the biggest problem that they have and why they really need some kind of merger with the ACC is the bid to the CFP eventually. They don't want to become a group of 5 school. The problem for your listeners that may not know is that, the ACC, unlike many conferences, actually has fairly interesting academic requirements.
Yeah.
And Washington State and Oregon State don't meet it. It's the same thing as the funky NC State thing. Like, NC State could never go to the Big Ten.
Right.
Because they're not AAU or AUU or whatever. They're not licensed.
Yep.
Yeah. And so there's Washington State and Oregon State, they could never make the case to get them into the ACC because they're just not prominent schools when it comes to, the academic side. And then the one that's really lost in the wash here is Arizona State.
Yeah.
I mean, the number 5 market in the country, it's more populated than just about anywhere now. It's growing faster than anything.
Yep.
They should be a superpower, but they just can't stop fumbling over themselves. And now where are you? Right? You're thinking, man, we've had some hard times at ASU since Jake Plummer left, and now we're in the Big 12? What the hell just happened?
Yeah. Well, the next time we talk, I want to... Something that is lost in this is that networks have paid out so much money for rights. There is a limit as to how far you can go, which the Pac-12 found out, because ESPN desperately wants to keep the NBA contract, and they want to keep the college football playoff contract in some form. At least have the semifinals, the finals, maybe an opening round. But see, I want to get into the next time we talk about these network entities trying to make sure that they balance their books while also making big bids on rights, and how they prioritize who is a must-have versus nice-to-have.
You and I talked about this, right, buddy? It's going to come down to what the NFL and the English Premier League did.
Yep.
Right? There's haves and there's have-nots. And if you allow that have and have-nots to get too wide, well, the have-nots start to disappear. And you start to create super conferences, this looks exactly like the English Premier League, where the top teams just eventually broke away from 100 years of tradition and created the English Premier League. Right? And so we're eventually headed towards what you said years ago on the air. Right? We're all in a 64-team conference, and you've got your mega conferences with your divisions and your playoffs and your national championship, which in the end, to me, seems like the most logical, endpoint anyways. I played a non-money sport in school, so I went to USC to play volleyball and basketball. Basketball is a money sport, volleyball is not.
Yeah.
Those football players, I was friends with all of them. You remember many of them. Carson Palmer was in my Bible study. I knew Barry Zito. Chris Claiborne was my lab partner.
Yeah.
And he got drafted 7th overall.
Yep.
Yeah. They are there to study football. And everybody hand-wringing and saying, oh, well, this is an academic institution. You can make just as much money, have just as much impact on the world, and have a great vocation in football as you can in anthropology. It is a job. So this hand-wringing about, I can't believe USC is going to fly all the way across the country to, why not? If they're going to end up being scouts or coaches or working on the business side of an NFL team, that's what they're going to do. The Philadelphia Eagles staff flies across the country on the weekends.
Yeah.
They balance their work with needing to do that. Isn't college for that? To prepare your vocation for the real world?
Exactly.
So I think I think we've got a couple of things to talk about, but I'm on the other side of that. I think these football players, this is a good thing for them.
I am too. I think at the end it's not going to be as complicated as people think, and there's a way with the other sports to make it work. My friend, the fact that you're safe and sound and your family is safe and sound is all it means to me. But it is, man, that went fast, didn't it?
Oh goodness, yeah. I enjoyed it. And next thing you know, we're going to be talking after you guys pound out West Virginia, right? You got them in a couple weeks.
Yeah. Yep. 2 weeks from Saturday. So I think I'll go to practice.
I cannot wait to see your quarterback. If you guys have a quarterback, this could be your year.
You're going to like him. You're going to like him.
All right.
You're going to like him. Okay. My friend, always a pleasure. I cannot wait until the next conversation.
All right, buddy. We'll talk soon.